Hello. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jason Toney, and I'll be the MC introducing the event today. I know people are still joining in, so while people continue to join in to our event, I'm going to go ahead and give you some information about Black Rose Books, about some of our books, a few housekeeping notes. So first, I want to thank you for joining us, and I want to thank our wonderful speakers for joining us today. We have András Göllner, David Mandel, and our moderator, Marie-Josée Lavallee. And I also want to go ahead and recognize our excellent partners who helped us publicize the events and put it together. So we have Haymarket Books, the Hungarian Free Press, Karl Polanyi Research Center for Global Social Studies at Corvinus University, Karl Polanyi Institute of Political Economy at Concordia University, the Esmalet Journal, the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College, the International Strikes and Social Conflicts Association, and the Hungarian Studies Association of Canada. And so a few housekeeping notes. Time will be allotted at the end for questions. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and type them into the chat box next to this screen. If you have any issue with that, you can go ahead and email me at jason@blackrosebooks.com. To go ahead and test the chat to make sure it works, please feel free to tell us where you're tuning in from right now. I know we have people tuning in from all over the world, so we'll be very curious to hear that, and it's a good way to test the chat and get familiar with it. If you have any technical issues with the live stream, you can lower your video quality, which usually helps, by clicking the gear wheel in the bottom of this video. If you click that, it will pop up a bunch of options for quality. Just select the lower one that is selected, and that should help. If it doesn't, go ahead and restart the page. The live stream will still be going on. It's also very important to note that the live stream at this link on YouTube will be here permanently. So you can share this now with friends if you think they might be interested in joining us. You can go ahead and share it with them now, or you can go ahead and share it after the fact. The video will stay here forever. So hopefully we do a good job. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and tell you about some of our books and give you some background as we allow people to continue to join. And we'll go ahead and get started soon. So the first book that I want to tell you about is The Forgotten Revolution, the 1919 Hungarian Republic of Councils, edited by András B. Göllner. It's the inspiration for our discussion today, and it includes contributions by well-respected scholars from all over Europe and North America, and it's an unprecedented international collaboration on the subject. The contributors are András B. Göllner, Raquel Varela, Peter Sunderlich, Marie-Josée Lavallee, Lajos Soma, Susan Zimmerman, Magda Aranjosi, Kari Polanyi-Levitt, Christopher Adam, and Dimitri Rousopoulos. You're going to hear a lot about this book, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but the electronic and physical version of the book will be published soon, towards the end of the summer. The next book I want to tell you about is 1917, Revolution in Russia and its Aftermath. This book features 3 books: My Disillusionment in Russia by Emil Goldman, The Russian Tragedy by Alexander Berkman, and The Kronstadt Uprising by Ida Met, with an introduction by Murray Bookchin. Each book describes the triumphs, disappointments, and horrors of the Russian Revolution. And it also includes an introductory poem by Dan Georgakis and essays by Thomas Jeffrey Miley and Dimitri Rousopoulos. The next book is Bolsheviks and Workers' Control in 1917 to 1921 by Maurice Brinton. This book both advances the historical discussion on workers' control in important ways, and it attempts a new kind of analysis on the fate of the Russian Revolution. It's of particular interest to those invested in the questions of participatory democracy and popular control. The next one I want to tell you about is 1968. On the Edge of World Revolution by Philip Gassert and Martin Klimka. This book presents short chapters written by local eyewitnesses and historical experts, which cover the tectonic events of 1968 in 39 countries. It's unique in its scope, and it's popularly read by university students, readers with a general interest, and researchers. And given the political movement unfolding today, it's of special interest to new and old students of revolution alike. In the foreword of the book, Dimitri Rousopoulos tells the reader that when they read this book, they should keep an old proverb in mind. When the finger points to the sun, The Idiot Looks at the Finger. And I think that sentiment still stands today and is one I wanted to remind us of before we get this event going. Another book that's very relevant to this conversation is Shockwaves, Eastern Europe After the Revolutions by John Pfeiffer. John Pfeiffer is an author and currently co-director of foreign policy and focus at the Institute for Policy Studies. He is a legend in his field. This book covers the political situations in the early 1990s and 80s in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and the former East Germany with incisive historical background. It received excellent reviews and would be a great thing to revisit. Participatory Democracy, Prospects for Democratizing Democracy by Dimitri Rousopoulos and George C. Benelo is a book well suited to our times, and it probes the historical roots of participatory democracy in our political culture, analyzing its modern application and exploring the possible forms it might take on every level of society. The Washington Post said the book is, by all odds, the most encompassing one so far in revealing the practical, actual subversions that the New Left wishes to visit upon us. It includes introductions by contributions by George Woodcock, Murray Bookchin, John McEwen, C.L.R. James, and many others, and it would be a great read for this moment as well. And some relevant books by our speakers and that tie into our sponsors. We have The Former State Socialist World, Views from the Left by David Mandel. David published this with us in 1996, and it brings together the foremost democratic socialists from the West and their Russian counterparts. And the book deals with the Russian working class and labor movement, gender and post-communist restructuring, the G7 and market reform in Russia, the left in Ukraine, and much more. David has published a wealth of important books on Russia and the Soviets and worker control, so we encourage you to look at all of them. He published one with our partner Haymarket Books, and he's published many with us, so you should check out his work if you're interested. And lastly, I wanted to briefly show you our Karl Polanyi series. We're thankful to the multiple Karl Polanyi societies from around the world that have joined us as partners today, and many of their members have contributed to these excellent books on the life and work of Karl Polanyi. I also want to take this moment to wish a happy birthday to Kari Polanyi Levitt, who just turned 97 on June 14th. She's an inspiration to us all and a huge part of how this talk came together. She connected me with a lot of the people, including András and others. So very thankful and grateful to her. So happy birthday, Kari. You can find all of these books either on our website at blackrosebooks.com or our new ebook shop, payhip.com/blackrosebooks. Basically, all of our books on payhip.com/blackrosebooks are discounted. All of our books right now that are about anarchism are especially discounted because there's so much misinformation spread about anarchism right now. So visit there if you want to learn more about that. We also always encourage you to buy books from your local bookshop. Indie bookshops are really struggling right now. So please order our books with a local independent bookshop if you can. But otherwise, these are great places to get our books. So now, without any further delay, I'll introduce our discussants and then we'll get started. So first, our moderator, Marie-Josée Lavallee, is a Quebecois historian and political philosopher. She has her PhD from the University of Montreal, and she teaches in the Department of History at the University of Montreal. András B. Göllner is a Hungarian-born Canadian political economist. He has his PhD from the London School of Economics. He's one of the founders of Concordia University School of Community and Public Affairs, and he is now an Emeritus Associate Professor of Political Science at Concordia. David Mandel is co-founder of the School for Worker Democracy in Moscow. He teaches political science at the University of Quebec in Montreal, where he's also active in the Union and the political left. So with all of you, I gladly hand it off to Marie-Josée so you can take it away. I hope you enjoy our event. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Jason. So this discussion will be organized in 3 parts, and the speakers will address 5 main topics. First, the history of the 1919 Hungarian Republic of Councils and its global historical significance. Second, the advance of the movement of working men and women to the center stage of global history from the late 19th century. the immortality of the revolutionary spirit, of the desire of working men and women to control their own lives, especially through grassroots, autonomous workers' councils. The German and Russian influences and interactions with the autonomous movement of the Hungarian labor movement. And finally, the relevance of these events and experiments today. I'd like to invite Professor Göllner to summarize the significance of the 1919 events and situate the book about these events in the cross-current of previous interpretations, and explain for us its relevance and timeliness.
Thank you, Mary Jose, and it's wonderful to see all of my panelists on the screen, and I hope we're being heard in Budapest and in many parts of the world. Before I get into my little 10-minute spiel, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on why we have chosen today as the occasion for this discussion. Today is the 62nd anniversary of the execution of Imre Nagy, who, as many of us know, was the head of the provisional government during the 1956 uprising. Imre Nagy was executed because he refused to disown the right of workers to self-management, the right of workers to take control of their own lives. And for this, he had to pay with his life. I would like to, all of us, take just 10 seconds to remember him. He was a giant of a man, and let's remember his memory. So, let's get back to the subject at hand. I would like to begin first by saying that the story of this book is a universal story. It's not a story of Hungary, but a story of the world, the story of a grand drama, a universal story, which began roughly at the beginning of the 19th century and with the ascent of working men and women to the center stage of history. So there's nothing, this is not simply a Hungarian story, but an international story. And with that proviso, let me just say a couple of words about the book itself and who are the contributors. This is a collective exercise, a book that doesn't reflect my views alone, but the views of 10 other people, 10 scholars from different parts of the world, uniting European, West European, East European, and North American scholars, 50-50 split between men and women, which is quite unusual. I'm not sure why, but so far most of the books written on these events in Hungary were written by men. I'm very happy that we have 5 women and 5 men contributing to this story. And the story, that we have to say, is not based on fiction, it's not based on hearsay, but it's based on facts, verifiable evidence. Now, I hope I can be seen, but to continue, what is the story of this book? So the book is about a giant revolution on the territory of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at during the early decades of the 20th century, and it was an uprising which had huge ramifications east and west. The peace negotiators in Versailles and in Paris felt that if the events in Budapest would come to fruition or spread, they could create a ruin for the imperialist powers. And the events in Budapest eventually became very embarrassing and difficult for the Soviet Union itself. What's significant about this revolution is that it is a hurricane as opposed to a tropical storm. We talk about political revolutions and social revolutions in our book. Political revolutions are like the ones that occurred throughout the 20th century, very much like the Kerensky Revolution in February 1917, or the one in Hungary in 1918, November, at the end of November, the so-called Chrysanthemum Revolution. Social revolutions are a much bigger deal. They revolve around the issue of transforming society and the fundamental basis of the production and distribution of goods and services. And this was the version that we see unfolding in Hungary. And of course, this was the version in Russia in October as well. So it's a momentous event. And the book wonders, why is it that some storms stay tropical storms and others become hurricanes? And the book seeks to answer the question to that. Now, why did we choose to write this book right now? The flippant answer is that it was time for it. But a more serious answer is that history has not been kind to this revolution. It has been largely ignored, distorted, or condemned over the past 100 years for various reasons. During the so-called bipolar era, East-West confrontation, it was embarrassing to the West, obviously, which didn't want to have anything to do with workers' control and workers' self-management. It was also embarrassing to the Soviet Union, which did not particularly look kindly upon workers putting the Bolshevik party into the back seat and controlling things directly themselves. So there were many periods throughout the past 100 years that this story has not been properly dealt with. Now, how is our story different? What's new about this book that we have put together, the 10 of us, from what has been written before? Obviously, we have not tried, or nor do we claim to have reinvented the wheel. There's been lots written, especially recently, about the 1919 events in Hungary, 1918, 1919 events. Some of them excellent books by Tibor Hajdú, by Tamás Kraus, by all kinds of people, including some of the people in our book, Peter Csunderlik, Lajos Csoma, Susan Zimmerman. The list is long and our time is short. Where we are perhaps different is that we are shifting the paradigm. We're shifting the narrative. Hungarian historiography has tended to treat the Hungarian working class a little bit like Sleeping Beauty and ascribe primary role to individual actors, to princes, to kings, to queens, to Bolsheviks, to Lenin boys, Lenin girls, if there were ever such. We have shifted the narrative. We're turning working men and women to the center stage. If I can use a little anecdote, it's past bedtime for young children in Budapest, so I guess I can recount this in a couple of minutes. The idea of Sleeping Beauty is very relevant, or the story of Sleeping Beauty is very relevant to our effort. Sleeping Beauty, as you all know, for a long time, for the past 200 years, certainly since the Grimm brothers came out with it in a rewritten format, describes a relationship between Prince Charming and Sleeping Beauty based on love and affection. Well, the original story is not like that at all. The original story of the 12th century shows that this love story is actually a rape story. In the original version of Sleeping Beauty, the prince comes up across the unconscious young girl, looks around, sneaks up on her, and impregnates her. She becomes pregnant with 2 boys. She sleeps through the entire pregnancy, the childbirth, and only comes awake when one of the little bastards sucks on her finger. He's hungry and sucks out the seedling that pricked her finger and put her to sleep for 100 years. So 1919 is not a love story which some of the historians today like to portray it, a love story starring Admiral Horthy, who kisses the Hungarian working class asleep and rights a wrong. but it is a rape story. It's a story of the working classes being raped. So I don't think I will go on too long now. There will be questions coming on, but basically what we are trying to do in this story is pay homage to the working men and women, hundreds of thousands of them, who at the end of World War I tried to pull their country out of the disaster which it was put into at the hands of the ruling establishment of the Austro-Hungarian aristocracy. And what we are trying to do is to change the narrative, to focus on their heroism, and to change the narrative where there seems to be no hero to 1919 on Hungarian minds. I just recently read an account by Gergő Bödök, which says there are only victims to 1919. This is not a heroic period. We argue that it is a heroic period. It's time to recognize the heroic activities of working men and women and what they did and what they tried to do. This is not a story, this is not a book that lauds the activities of Béla Kun. It doesn't laud the activities of the Lenin boys. It lauds the activities of working women, and it encourages people today to take similar actions in the midst of this pandemic, in the midst of this newest catastrophe for capitalism that sees millions and millions of working men and women out of work and being lied to. So this is roughly the outlines of our book.
Thanks, Professor Göllner, for telling us, for giving us a sense of the spirit which animates the book. I will now turn to Professor Mandel. Professor Mandel, you're there. Could you please give us an outline of the global significance of the Great October Revolution and maybe especially explain the role played by the Soviets in the Russian revolutions?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Well, I'll try to say something in 10 minutes, okay? I think the immediate international significance of the October Revolution was the adoption of the Decree on Peace by the Congress of Soviets on the day after the insurrection that overthrew the Liberal Provisional Government. Okay, that decree called peoples and governments at war immediately to begin peace talks to conclude a democratic peace. There's a peace without territorial annexations, without financial reparations, and one that recognized the right of nations to self-determination. So that appeal evoked a very strong response among the popular classes of the other countries that were at war, that were suffering terribly from this unprecedented international slaughter. And soon after, the Soviet government published the secret treaties of the Entente, as of Britain, France, and England, that exposed their imperialist aims. And a few weeks later, at the negotiations with Germany and Austro-Hungary at Brest-Litovsk, the imperialist character of the war from their side also was exposed. So the October Revolution, its immediate international significance was to show the popular classes in the other countries at war a way out of the slaughter. That is, they had to take power into their own hands. They had to exclude the property classes from government, that is the bourgeoisie and the landowners, as they supported the imperialist war. And they also the property classes also needed the war to keep the property class, to keep the workers and peasants from demanding social and political reforms that would have threatened their power and wealth. So this was the immediate goal of the seizure of power in October by the Soviets, that is to put power into the hands of representatives of the popular classes, of the workers and peasants, and to exclude the property classes, the landlords and the bourgeoisie, from any influence over the government. Because these were intent of not only of continuing the war, but they wanted to impose a military dictatorship, as which eventually happened in Hungary. So the Soviets, in Russian, these are councils. These were elected assemblies of workers and soldiers delegates. They first appeared in the revolution of 1905 as sort of citywide strike committees set up during general strikes. And they reappeared in the February Revolution of 1917. And this was a democratic revolution, or as my colleague just said, it was a political revolution that didn't have socialist objectives. but it was directed at ending the imperialist war and at various social reforms, including land reform. So by October 1917, the Bolshevik Party, which was the left wing of Russian social democracy, had won strong majorities in all the major urban Soviets and in many of the military units. The Bolsheviks won these majorities because they were the only party that called for Soviet power. That is, for the transfer of power to the property classes to the exclusion of the property classes. And by that time, the workers and peasants had become convinced that the property classes and their liberal political representatives in the provisional government were intent on continuing the war. Not only that, but they were intent on reversing the February Revolution and then establishing a military dictatorship. So the more moderate socialist policy didn't support the Soviet seizure of power. They insisted on keeping the liberals in government. But soon after October, the left social revolutionaries, which were a left peasant party, decided to join the Soviet government and form a coalition. So this was a real dictatorship at that time of the lower classes of society, of the workers and peasants. That is the vast majority of Russian society, to the exclusion of any political influence of the property classes. So the social program of the October Revolution was not clear at the beginning. Besides ending the war with a democratic peace and certain social reforms like the 8-hour day and land reform, the Soviet government did not initially intend to suppress capitalism. As Marxists, the Bolshevik felt that the Russian economy on its own was not sufficiently developed for successful socialist transformation. But the political dynamics of the 3-year-long civil war that followed, in which the Russian counter-revolutionary forces were supported by all the major capitalist countries of the world, including Canada, which sent troops over there. This unleashed the dynamic that led to nationalization of industry and the suppression of the market. So during this period, the Soviet leadership's hope was that their revolution would inspire revolutions in the more developed countries. And then they would come to Russia's aid and help it to develop along a socialist path of development. So the period after the October Revolution saw the rise of intense class struggles in all the capitalist countries, including Hungary. And although these popular upsurges were ultimately beaten back, they played a major role in the survival of the Russian Revolution, because the capitalist countries just couldn't find the troops, loyal troops to send over. But the revolution survived in extremely difficult circumstances, and I'm arriving at the end now. So I think most historians condemn the October Revolution as a criminal enterprise. Okay, they pass over in silence the 40 million dead and wounded of the imperialist war. But I would argue that the October Revolution deserves our admiration because it is done according to the dictum that should guide all progressive movements. Fais ce que doit, advienne qui pourra. Do what must, and happen what will happen.
Thank you, Professor Nander. At this point, maybe a few words about the the German connection and the German experience may be helpful to put the Hungarian and Russian experiences in perspective. From Marx and Engels' time, Germany was regarded as the country where a successful revolution was most likely to occur. Germany, at the end of the 19th century, was one of the world's leading industrial countries. It had a large and well-developed industrial working class and a well-developed network of associations and unions also. And the German Social Democratic Party was the leader of the Second International, which was founded in 1889. At the time, also, a host of debates around socialism and democracy revolved around the thesis of famous figures like Kautsky, Bernstein, and Rosa Luxemburg. So for all these reasons, when the wave of revolutions broke out in 1917, first in Russia, everything seemed to point to Germany as the epicenter of the world revolution. And even the Russians regarded an upcoming German revolution as a key to the endurance of their own revolution. Germans, especially workers and sailors, have started to organize themselves in councils in the spring of 1917, even though the council's official date of birth in Germany is January 1918. Events in Russia seem to prove that mass action can give concrete results, and calls to give all power to the Soviet or to set up the dictatorship of the proletariat were galvanizing the masses in Germany and elsewhere in Central Europe. In Germany, it is hunger, lack of essential supplies, suspension of civil liberties, military discipline at workplace, power abuses in the armed forces, and desire for peace that prompt people to storm the street, to go on strike, and to organize councils. People will also ask for universal suffrage and the abolition of censorship. But it is really important to understand a fact. The idea that councils could be organs of power, self-government, self-management, that they could be the founding stones of an entirely different kind of government, a new type of government, of a council republic, was alien to most of these people. The same is true of any plan for an upcoming proletarian revolution or world revolution. Few people had such vision or such expectations, save for the Spartacus League and a few grassroots organizations. At best, councils were viewed as organs of struggle for better living conditions or democratization of society. Hundreds of thousands, while their country were sending them to their death, were regarding this insane butchery as the offspring of the capitalist system. And yet, few contemplated their struggle as an all-out war against capitalism. In Germany, it was the sailors who were idle for most of the war and who went on strike repeatedly, and some have paid their insubordination with their lives, who spread the revolutionary fire, not the soldiers, not the workers as such. Soldier council did not have a prominent role in Germany, by contrast with, for instance, Russia or Hungary. There were desertions as elsewhere, but most soldiers' councils were created at a late date and they were manipulated by the German High Command. The sailors embarked on revolutionary action to avoid a desperate suicidal offensive against the British Navy. In the meantime, workers in Berlin were preparing for weeks for a big insurrection. And this strike, which will unleash the Berlin Revolution, could have broken out earlier, as Karl Liebknecht from the Spartacus League wished. But leaders like Richard Müller, who was the leader of the group which represent the workers, the revolutionary shop stewards, was hesitating. So they postponed a few times. In Germany, councils will never play a prominent political role. They will never have a share in government, as it happened for a while in Russia, for instance, during the so-called period of dual power, or after the October Revolution, or as in Hungary. They were marginalized from the onset. That said, let's move to the second part of this discussion. It's a question and answer part. I will ask a few questions and each speaker will answer in turn. So let's start with the first question. What degree of confidence did workers have in the execution of a social as opposed to political revolution? A political revolution occurs when political power changes hands. One speaks of social revolution when economic power, ownership, and control over the means of production is at stake. I will invite Professor Göllner to speak to us a bit about the Hungarian case.
Okay, I think I missed just the little bit of your front part of your question, but I assume we're talking now about the difference between political and social revolution and how the situation played out in Hungary. Now, social revolution is a tsunami. It's an attempt to politically and economically control who gets what, when, and how in a society. And in Hungary, this is what happened. Workers' councils began to be formed in Hungary well before 1919. They were, in fact, the engines that toppled the bourgeois political revolution of the Károly regime, not discounting, of course, the tremendous pressure the Entente powers played in this entire drama. But workers' councils had a very prominent role in Hungary. And after March 21st, 1919, we see a shift in the relationship between the councils, which were autonomous organizations, attempts to self-control, self-manage, run the affairs of local communities, and the relationship with the Socialist Party, which was not a coalition, but a fusion between the Bolsheviks and the Social Democratic Party of Hungary. So in Hungary, there was a bitter power struggle on many fronts. There was a power struggle between the various factions of the political parties that tried to dominate the process of the revolution, and the workers' councils from below, who felt they were in the driver's seat, or should be in the driver's seat, rightfully so, and being hamstrung, manipulated, controlled, put down, not being allowed to do the things that they had wanted to do. So there was a very, very interesting power struggle. And this is one of the reasons for the collapse of confidence in the Béla Kun regime and the Revolutionary Governing Council that he led. Of course, the story of Hungary is much more complex. It was overrun by foreign troops. 75% of the country was controlled by forces outside of the government. And it was also abandoned by the Hungarian communists or socialists, were abandoned by their Austrian brothers and sisters and by the Russians in the end, and were left to fend for themselves against overwhelming odds. It was a very tough time.
And Professor Manda, what about Russia? About the confidence of workers to implement a social revolution? Although you said earlier that this was not a plan before the events.
Yeah, it was. The February Revolution was a democratic revolution with the main social demand. The main social reforms were the land reform for the peasants, which was basically an anti-feudal reform, and the 8-hour day for workers. What happened though is that the dynamics of the situation, for example, workers' control, by which wasn't the demand of any party before 1917. It was completely from below. It was a response after the February Revolution into March and April. The workers started noticing that production in their enterprises was being held up. That the owners were saying, "Well, there's no supplies, there's no fuel, there's no this or that," and the workers began to suspect this might be sabotage. Now, where did this suspicion come from? It came from the fact that a major arm of the employers against workers' strikes had been lockouts. For example, in 1914, in the 8 months before the war broke out, there were 3 citywide lockouts in response to general strikes, so that it was natural for the workers to suspect a creeping lockout, and indeed there was one. And this is how workers' control arose as a response to a real challenge. It didn't arise out of any kind of ideological view. Well, it's going to be a socialist revolution, and we have to run the factories. And the same thing happened after October. That is, the demand to nationalize the factories came from below. Workers wanted simply to save their jobs. The industrialists lost their, if they had it, they lost any appetite to run their factories, and there was actually a concerted policy of sabotage. And the Soviet government wasn't ready for this. And you can read the minutes of the conferences of the factory committees and how they were struggling with this. And so that actually by June 1918, all the major industries began to be nationalized, but this had not been a plan. The Bolshevik Party came into the October Revolution without really an economic program. Lenin's idea was kind of state capitalism. That is where a Soviet government, a workers' and peasants' government, would regulate the capitalist economy. And the first thing they did was naturally to nationalize the banks, which give them control of finances. But given the fact that the industry was shutting down, also the transport was totally ruined, and they had to find how to feed the cities. And industry stopped producing anything that the peasants could buy in exchange for their grain. And this led to the suppression of the market. They had to take the grain without paying for it. And so on the face of it, they suppressed capitalism. But it was, at least at the origins, it was a way to save the revolution. Obviously, with the hopes of a world revolution in Germany and Austria and the developed country, they felt that this may be the beginning of a socialist development for Russia. So that was the dynamic. So it was a dynamic that led to a social revolution.
Thank you. In Germany, either there were no plans for the implementation of ownership and control over the means of production by the workers. And anyway, on November 9, there will be two bodies that will be created. On November 9 was the day of the Berlin Revolution. It was a body made up from the SPD members, so the Social Democratic Party, which was by the time very bourgeois and conservative. And they were supposed to share power with the councils, but it was not. It doesn't happen like that. And the ruling committee set up by the SPD will make sure that such an option, such development toward self-management will be impossible. They will create, instead of workers' council, a set of what they call factory committees to make sure that workers' council will not move themselves in the German firms. And in fact, Professor Göllner?
Live streaming is on.
Well, as I think I alluded to this in my previous comment, the situation in Hungary altered dramatically from March 21st onwards. You must realize that in Hungary and in the Republic of Councils, there was an executive organ of government which is called the National Revolutionary Council. And there was a legislative body, which was the National Congress of Councils, and the elections for the legislature were held just weeks after the revolution on April the 7th, without very much preparation. But at any event, those who were active in the workers' councils, which, as I indicated, have begun springing up well before the March 21st date, wanted to play a leading role. And there was a struggle for this right, the leading role towards a new society which recognizes justice, which recognizes equality before the law, and which recognizes the right of working men and women to ecologically sustainable communities. The Hungarian Revolution in 1919 wasn't scripted. David is entirely right in the Russian case too. This was not a revolution where working men and women ran around with the little red book in their hands. Most of them had the faintest idea of what socialism is about. The only reason why they spouted socialism is because it was the only slogan that offered them breathing space, the only word that gave them some kind of sympathetic hearing. What the workers in Hungary in 1919 wanted was to manage their own affairs, to be responsible for their own affairs, rather than to be following directions and paths which led to ruin. 1 million Hungarians were pushed into fleeing their countries prior to World War I. After World War I, another million were either killed, injured, or wounded. It was a huge catastrophe, and the entire political economic establishment of Hungary was defunct, and there was time for change.
Thank you. And what about the relations between the Bolshevik Party and the councils, Professor Mendel?
Well, it depends when. In in 1917, between the February and October revolutions, the councils were these were elected by workers and peasants and soldiers delegates. And at first, they had a majority of in the cities of moderate socialists, because it was a democratic revolution, and it seemed that the property classes had in February finally came around to support the revolution. At least they didn't oppose it, and that had made the February Revolution a very easy affair. There was very little bloodshed. The property classes were out in the streets. They were wearing red ribbons and everything, and this meant that the state administration, the military, didn't object forcefully to the revolution. So there was a sense of national unity at the beginning. But the workers, the previous history, the previous 10, 15 years, had also had shown the workers that the property classes were fundamentally opposed to their interests, so this was a kind of national reconciliation, but it was on a very tentative basis. And quite soon, the question of the war arose. The provisional government refused to propose peace talks. In fact, it continued to support the war. It launched a new offensive in June under pressure from France and England. Also, it did nothing to try to organize the economy, which was falling apart under pressure of the war, but also the sabotage of the industrialists. And of course, it didn't do the land reform, even though the Peasant Party was part of the government. So this led to the workers recalling the moderate socialists from the Soviets and electing Bolsheviks. And I have to say, the Bolshevik Party in 1917 was a genuine workers' party. It was flesh of the working class. Maybe the Central Committee had a lot of intellectuals, but all the middle and top levels, especially in Petrograd, all the district and the city committees were majority workers. And this is actually why Lenin and Trotsky were able to actually move the leadership to support the October Revolution. As you know, Zinoviev and Kamenev were quite opposed to it because people felt it would be a disaster, like it had been. Anyway, and it was the support from below that, so I think that's something very important to emphasize. And even during the Civil War, obviously, when it moved towards the dictatorship, largely under pressure of the war and the economic collapse, not because of an ideological penchant of the Bolsheviks, the main force in the revolution was the workers. And you mentioned the sailors in Germany. I just want to say a word about that. There's something about sailors. Ships are like factories. And at least in Russia, the sailors were radical too. I mean, they were mostly recruited actually from among workers, but also their way of their existence was something akin to factories, and that is why they're the most revolutionary elements in the armed forces in Russia too. So that would be my answer.
What you said about the Bolshevik attitude towards the councils remind me a bit of the attitude of the SPD in Germany. The SPD was like the traditional champion of working class interests until it decided to back the entry of Germany into war in 1940. So it became afterwards a fully bourgeois party. And it tried to kill the revolutionary momentum at every corner, and especially the council movement. So the party was split in 1917 after it expelled the bad radicals who chose to support the strikes for bread and the strikes for peace. And a new party will be set up, a left party, which will welcome people from the left, center, and the left of the SPD, and also from other groups. And the Spartacus League will also be under this label of the USPD, the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany. And this party tried to had better relationships with the councils. They were struggling together, but at some point during the November Revolution, some were already moving toward the SPD, so they became more bourgeois, while others like Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, who formed the Communist Party of Germany, of course, were and remain unconditional advocates of the proletarian revolution, of socialism, and of council power. But say for them, we can say that in Germany, parties really worked against the councils. Let's move now to our third question. What was the role of women in the post-World War I revolutions in Hungary, in Russia, and in Germany? So maybe Professor Göllner would like to start?
Yes, briefly, and I wish on this question a woman would be the person responding. That would be appropriate. But I can just briefly reflect on the words written in our book by the late Magda Aranyosi and Susan Zimmerman, and my own reflections on this question with my old friend, the late Ilona Duchinska, who I got to be quite close to during the last 3 years of her life. Women were very active at grassroots level. They were very active, or tried to be very active, in the workers' councils, but they were very much under the thumbs both of the Social Democratic Party leadership, and have been for decades prior to 1919, and also were subservient to the Bolshevik leadership, the Bolshevik Party of Hungary, or the Party of Hungarian Communists, which was formed in November 1918 and only had about 4 months of life before this whole conflagration started in 1919. Women were very active, and you will see from the chapter in our book in what ways. Unfortunately, they were denied and held back throughout the Hungarian Republic of Councils from assuming the positions that they were ascribing to. They were held back in numbers, and they were held up or held back in terms of taking leadership positions. But they were deeply involved in the struggle for justice and equal rights, and were active combatants for a better world in Hungary. And they have not been paid justice by Hungarian historians up to the present time, with a few exceptions, like Emily Gioli, or the people that I mentioned, or Judith Sapor, for example, or Andrea Petter, and some of the colleagues that I have been consulting with. But it's an untold story, and it's about time that it was told.
Thank you. And Professor Mandel, maybe some of you in the public have already seen these pictures of women everywhere in the streets during the Petrograd events, which will unleash the Russian Revolution of February. But past this moment, did women play a central role in the revolution, a direct role in the revolution, or in councils in Russia?
Yeah. First, I have to say it's not a subject, unfortunately, that I've studied closely. But as you said, the February Revolution began on International Women's Day, which was March 8th. The Russian calendar was 13 days behind. So we could say the women workers, especially textile workers, which was mainly female, began the revolution. I think before the revolution, as far as the Bolsheviks had they had a monthly journal called the Woman Worker, and you can see the main concern was how to get women active, how to activate them, and they were very clear. It wasn't because women were backward or anything. It's because they had the family responsibilities. Their life revolved between the factory and their children, and they had no time. And I think that's the main reason that obviously men were in the fore in the revolutionary movement in 1917 and in the Civil War too. All I can say is you know that the Soviets did adopt very progressive laws in terms of marriage and abortion and gay rights, etc. And then after the Civil War, they had the factories had women's committees, and also the sociological studies group, whose main their main goal in these studies was to figure out how to get women active in public life. This lasted till about 1925-26. Then the women's committees in the factories were shut down when Stalinist fraction became totally dominant. So that's about all I can say. I mean, also, if you're, I might just recommend a wonderful novel, Russian Soviet novel from the early 20s on the Civil War, where the heroine is a woman. It's by Vikenty Veresayev, Versaev. It's called The Deadlock, and it's about the Civil War in Crimea. And there, I mean, the heroine is a woman intellectual, which is a rare thing. And also, there's quite a bit about actually what, even in these terrible circumstances, when the Soviets did control that part of Crimea, it changed hands a lot, what they tried to do to bring women into public life. And I think it's a very interesting novel because it's written from the point of view of a non-Bolshevik woman. Her father was a Menshevik who opposed the Bolsheviks. So it's a very interesting novel. I think it should be republished. Maybe I could suggest it to Black.
Thank you very much for this suggestion. Situation in Germany is similar since women are very seldom at the forefront of historical accounts of the revolution. But we know that, for instance, in Berlin and other cities, women have participated in the setting up of the first worker councils. And of course, they were at the forefront also of the big strikes of 1916, 1917, and also of the huge industrial strike of January 1918, which really prepared the ground for the Berlin Revolution. So let's now move to the fourth question. According to you, why these revolutions fail? Why revolution fail? Why the October which is the October Revolution is considered as a failure, but you have a different opinion about that, and in Hungary and in Germany. So maybe Professor Mandel would like to start on this question.
Russia, I mean, the Russian Marxists themselves said socialism couldn't succeed in Russia if it were isolated, and it was also a basic tenet of Marxism that a revolution in one country, in general, and especially in a backward country, which was majority peasants, and the peasants were basically individualists, and but also the Civil War led to a centralization of power and establishment of a party dictatorship, and then the situation at the end of the Civil War. The economy was totally destroyed. The working class, which had been the major political force in the revolution, was bled dry and dispersed. And industry was barely working. And this was the social background for the rise of the bureaucracy. I have to say though that, after October, the need for centralization of power was recognized by everybody, including the workers in the factory committees, which you'd say would be closest to an anarchist point of view, because the industry was shutting down, and there was a limited amount of fuel, a limited amount of raw materials, and this had to be decided centrally who would get what. And every factory individually, of course, wanted the little that there was. Besides that, by April, the Civil War was really heating up, and this gave an added impetus to the need for centralization. And finally, the fact that you had to feed the city, you had to feed the Red Army. The peasants, there was nothing to give the peasants in return for their grain. Money was valueless. You had to take it by force. And they decided, first, I don't see any other way. And this called for authoritarian measures. And the peasants, they taught.
Professor Mandel, are you still there? Unfortunately, we don't hear you nor see you.
Okay.
Maybe Professor Göllner would like to take the ball.
Well, I'll take the ball. I think the question is enormously important, and there have been so many attempts to answer it. Eric Hobsbawm, the great British historian, has reduced it to a very simple equation in his foreword to Ilona Duchinska's book, Workers in Arms, by basically pointing out the superiority of the Marxist talent in Austria and Germany as opposed to Hungary, much to the fury of Ilona, who would spend the entire book refuting that. There are those who say that the Republic of Councils in Hungary failed because of the stupidities or the cruelties of the Bolsheviks, the Lenin boys' excesses, who killed roughly 450, 500 people. But the failure of the revolution in Hungary is far more complex than that. One is that it is a combination of factors. It's a combination of factors. Hungary was stuck between a hard and a stone, a hard spot and a stone. I'm not sure what is the exact English word for this. She was surrounded by hostile forces. All of the successor states' armies were invading her at the end of World War I. Her comrades in Austria and in Russia, by and large, military comrades, abandoned the country, which was hoping to get out of this revolution with the support of the Russian Red Army. It didn't come through. So invasion, the damages of the war, the horrible pain and suffering that that country had to incur, and the huge pressure put on Hungary by the imperial powers, all added up to a force that this little mouse, which was the remnant of the great Austro-Hungarian Empire, couldn't deal with. And yes, part of the equation, part of the problem was the inexperience and the ineffectiveness, the inability of the Bolshevik or socialist leadership of the day to manage this transition in a manner appropriate enough. They tried to bite off too much, too fast, too soon, and thought that they could leap from feudalism or semi-feudalism into socialism in a matter of weeks. It was an impossible task. It ended in failure.
Thank you. You want to add something?
No, I think that's it.
Good. Similar factors have played a role in Germany, I will say, because at least for the rulers who took the reign of the German Republic, it was clear that they couldn't risk an experiment like that of the Bolshevik in Russia, because the Entente powers were there and were trying to crush the communist regime. But there are also a combination of factors which explain why this revolution failed. And among these, it is clear that the people lack confidence in their capacity to create new institutions. And there was also a lack of long-term vision beyond some very specific demands, and a lack of convergence also between the actors. I think that all these factors were decisive in the failure of this revolution. And also, the German working class had, in general, better working and living conditions that the other workers elsewhere in Europe, for instance. So, in a way, they had more than their chance to lose. And if the SPD was very fast in bargaining and offering some gifts to the working class soon after November 9, it will take only months or at best a year or two before they start to take these gifts back. So the workers had the feeling that they have won a new bargaining power, but it won't last. And once they will realize that they have been fooled, it was too late. Even the SPD itself will become increasingly marginalized in the new German Republic, which will be very right-wing oriented, and fascism was already gaining ground. So I think that Professor Mandel is back. Are you back? Okay, I think that we'll start taking some questions from the public and maybe leave a last question for us for the end if we have time. So one of the viewers wants to know practically how worker councils were organized. What were their structures, procedures, and responsibilities? Of course, they could be many variants between countries, cities, and even between factories and military units. So, could you tell us a bit about how they work, how they were organized concretely?
Yes. Shall I have a quick try?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a fantastic chapter in our book by Lajos Csoma who answers that question, and he's very knowledgeable and one of the few people in Hungary who writes about this. Tamás Kraus is another one, and there are a few others, but it's something that has not been looked at closely enough. It's also, very odd, for example, that in the 1956 uprising, the first to write about workers' councils, which were in fact the backbones of the 56 uprising, was a British guy, Bill Lomax, and most of the historiography is on other matters, the various political parties that came into being. What the Russians or what the Hungarian communists did. Workers' councils played a very important role in both revolutions, and both cases they were organized from the bottom up. In both cases, but certainly in 1919, the Bolsheviks and the Socialist Party, Social Democrats wanted to gain control the nominating process, who could run for workers' councils, so on and so forth. But they were continuously rebuffed, and nowhere else more directly than in the Greater Budapest Council of Workers and Soldiers. There was a running battle. There was almost a dual power between the revolutionary governing council of the commissariats and the Greater Budapest Council of Workers and Soldiers. And it was a bottom-up organization that was constantly being tampered with. And the party and the trade union movement of trade union leaders, not movements, trade union leaders in Hungary tried to control them. It was a bitter struggle. The revolutionary struggle took place on many fronts, against foreign forces and against domestic forces. And unfortunately, the Republic didn't have very good leadership at all. The leadership of Béla Kun is indicative. On the third day of the revolution, he would lie to Lenin himself in a telegraph, telling him, because Lenin was obviously very suspicious and worried about what's going on in Hungary with this fusion between the communists and the Social Democrats. And why did the Hungarian Bolsheviks give up their lever, their power? And Béla Kun wrote to Lenin not to worry. There are no workers' councils in Hungary as such, word for word. And it was published in Pravda. But it is indicative, that telegram is indicative of how the Bolshevik Party or the socialist leadership viewed workers' councils in Hungary. They tried to deny their existence, their force, and their right to leadership.
Thank you. Maybe I could make a little parallel with the situation in Austria. Councils in Austria did not have a big political role. They were not really visible, but in many cities, they concretely worked to gather food supplies and essential stuff, and they were distributing it to the people. And they worked often in tandem with the Austrian SPD or other organizations that were there to help people, because the material situation in Austria was really, really bad after the end of the war. Maybe we'll take now another question from the public. What are the most notable differences between 1990 and 1956? Pardon me. So between both Hungarian revolutions. Professor Göllner?
Well, that's a marvelous question. Again, we're very short of time, and I'm sure there are lots of people with lots of questions, so I'll try to answer very briefly. One of the interesting things to me, for example, is that when the Red Army moved into Hungary at the end of 1945 to liberate Hungary from the fascist rule of the Nazi troops, the first people who were hunted down in Hungary in 1945 were some of the veterans of the 1919 revolution. One of the reasons why that was is because the veterans of the 1919 revolution were people who believed in workers' councils, who believed in radical workers' control. And for Stalin and for the Bolsheviks in Russia, this wasn't the game. This wasn't part of the chess game at that time in history. At that time, the Hungarian communists wanted to play their so-called salami tactics, not to show their cards, not to scare the West, not to scare the French reactionary forces, the capitalists in Western Europe, who might take strong measures against the rising Communist Party political strength in Western Europe. So the victims of the first incursion into Hungary of the revival of, shall we say, Bolshevik rule in Hungary in 1945 were the veterans of 1919. But the question was, how do the two revolutions differ? I think or how are they similar? And I think the similarities are striking. Both of them had workers' councils as their backbones, and both of them were driven certainly by a desire on the part of the key players not to allow capitalists to regain their properties, their lands, their factories, their businesses, but to allow working people to control their destinies and to own and manage these enterprises. This doesn't mean that working people wanted to put uneducated individuals at the head of the factories. They were willing to vote in experts, professionals, engineers, if need be, to run the factories for them, but do it the way they want it to be done. And that is a very important similarity, I think, between 1919 and 1956. There's a great similarity also between 1848 and 1919 and 1956, and 1789, if you will, the French Revolution. But we're maybe going a little bit far afield from what the question was.
Thank you. I think that Professor Mandel is back. Are you back?
Yeah, I'm back, yeah.
Okay, good. So do you remember where you left? Because you can continue and I can go on with another question.
I just wanted to react to the when the Soviet troops came in. The first ones they arrested were the communists Hungarian communists that had participated in the 1919 revolution. I mean, if you look at one of the major targets of Stalin's terror in 36 and 37 were the revolutionaries of the 1917 Civil War. I mean, Stalin basically destroyed the whole old guard. So this was really a kind of a counter-revolution, and it's clear why he would go after them. The same people also in Hungary. I just want to say something about the fate of the councils in Russia in the Civil War. I mean, I think it's a problem that socialists and maybe Marxists and other socialists haven't really confronted. Is that if there ever is some form of workers and popular classes taking power, it's clear it won't go without. It won't happen without resistance. And in Russia, the major factor that led to the rise of dictatorship and the suppression of the councils was definitely the Civil War and the collapse of the economy. And it's interesting is that the factory councils meeting in 1918, trying to save industry, trying to save the factories, they pushed for centralization. And they were anarchists at these meetings saying, well, listen, we need centralization, but let's have an amendment here that if the orders coming from above contradict the interests of the working class, then we won't follow them. And the answer was, of course you're right, but we just elected these central economic councils. You know, of course, if they do go against the workers, then we will not accept these orders. In fact, we'll probably have to make another revolution. And if you read the memoirs, the letters that Victor Serge, who was a French anarchist, who arrived in 1919 and came to Russia. In these letters, he supports the centralization of power and even the dictatorship. And he says, of course, these people may cling to power after the emergency is over. In that case, we'll have to make another revolution. My point is that I think as socialists, we have to think harder about this problem. What happens when there is a real clash of real class war, and how to maintain a democracy and how to maintain the elements of freedom that these conditions of really political struggle work against. I think it's a question I think Marxists haven't really looked at. And I think that's one of the reasons why social democrats are always so popular, because they feel this transition can happen smoothly, without with the same. We'll have the same state. We'll change a few personnel, etc. I don't think that's very realistic. So I think it's a real question.
Thank Professor Mendel for this connection with the present. I was about to make it. So I will merge one of the questions I had saved for the end and a question from the public. So what of the future? Globalized capitalism appears to be as efficient in generating contradictions and harmful side effects as ever. In this context, and faced to this recognition, what can be applied, for instance, from these past revolutions to the present urgent need to move to a new economic and social model? Professor Göllner.
Well, you mean what is the solution for humanity's survival? Is that what you're asking me? But let me try to be a little serious. The important thing that we must grasp is that revolutionary movements arise for one reason, starting in the 19th century, and that reason is the emergence of capitalism. Capitalism is the great irritant. That is the irritant time and time again in Ireland, in Mexico, in Spain, in Hungary, hundreds of places in Chile. That's the irritant that sparks revolutions. And capitalism is here with us today. We have all kinds of lovely fairy tales about capitalism and democracy, that they're like peas in a pod. It's a lot of BS. Capitalism has rejected and recoiled every single advance of democracy ever since it has been in existence. It's a lousy marriage. It's right now in terrible shape. Look at the artificial blonde bomber who is squatting in the White House and what he's doing to democracy in the United States. Look at what's happening in Hungary under Viktor Orban, the great pretender who has mastered the language of Christianity in order to stuff his pocket full of money stolen from European taxpayers and Hungarians. The future doesn't look good. The future will look good when people rise, when people raise their arms like those on the cover of our book and say enough is enough. And the future will get better when we listen to them and we follow their wisdom and listen to the three fundamental messages that have been coming from the people for 200 years. Give us justice, give us equality before the law, and give us ecologically sustainable communities. Never mind socialism, never mind Marxist, never mind these devalued terms. Now I'm speaking for myself and not my colleagues. Socialism has been given a horribly black eye by some of its practitioners in Russia, in the Soviet Union, in Hungary, throughout the Soviet Empire. Let's talk about three things: justice, equality before the law, and ecologically sustainable communities. That's what working men and working women want. Nothing more, nothing less. and forget about the scripts and blaming Marx and blaming socialist theorists for the unrest in the world. The unrest in the world is caused by capitalism and its greedy, lying, thieving behavior. Thank you.
I totally agree with you, so I won't add anything. Professor Mandel would like to say something about this question, but you already started, so.
Well, I mean, I fully agree with Mr. Göllner. I just like to say that what's at the basis of capitalism? It's really the economic power of the bourgeoisie, of this 1% of the minority, and that to get rid of capitalism, this power has to be democratized, and that's why there's no real democracy under even political democracy under capitalism, because any government that wants to govern with this economy has to always seek the confidence of the investors. Otherwise, the economy is going to be in trouble. And that's why there's no social justice. That's why despite what all the scientists say, there's no real movement against the ecological crisis. And so that poses the question of socialism, really. And I think that we really are where Rosa Luxemburg put us. I don't know when she said it, 1918, or probably just before she died. It's socialism or barbarism. And I think barbarism is advanced. We're probably there already, and we've been there. We're going back, and we're advancing very quickly. I think it's really a question of, do we want to live in a civilization, a civilized society of any form? Then we have to get rid of capitalism. And that means democratizing, first of all, democratizing the economy. That's the condition for democracy generally. And that's basically it.
Thank you. There is more or less...
Can I just have one little word just to reconnect to this Sleeping Beauty fairy tale that I talked about earlier? I think capitalism is the original prince in the original Sleeping Beauty story, who comes in, sneaks in the middle of the night, takes advantage of the innocent young woman who is unconscious in her bed, marches back to the bedside of his wife, and then writes a story about it as a love story, when in fact he has just raped someone. And I think what we have to remember is that working men and women throughout the centuries have tolerated a great deal of abuse. They have tolerated it quietly, and oftentimes this toleration has been taken as consent, whereas in fact all that quietness, that sleepiness signifies is that working men and women have a hand over their mouth. They have a knife pointed at their throat. They have a knee on their neck, like George Floyd in Minneapolis. And that is why they cannot shout. That is why they cannot speak out. But they will. And they are speaking out right now in the United States, and they will speak out in Hungary as well. And the time will come. Capitalism has created revolutionary situations. Marx is not the creator of revolution. He's just the follower of it. He's the chronicler of it. And I think, again, it's time to dispense with this term socialism. Look at poor Bernie Sanders, what socialism got him in the United States. He got thrown out to the sidelines. If he hadn't used socialism and said justice, equality before the law, and ecologically sustainable development, he'd be heading the Democrats right now. The word is tainted.
Thank you.
Sorry.
We are almost out of time. I'd like to take another question from the public very, very fast, because it's a very important one for this discussion. Could we conclude that historical experience shows the transitory character of the worker councils as a power structure and its inevitable course towards representative democracy or totalitarianism? Professor Göllner, Professor Mandel, what's your feeling about that?
Me?
Yeah, if you want. Could they become permanent organs of power, self-government,
I think
self-management?
any real democracy has to be based upon very rank and file organization like workers' councils. The question is, there have to be social and economic conditions for that, and I think it's obviously impossible, certainly under capitalism, and because there the power and the economy is concentrated in the hands of the 1%, obviously. so that the problem is the transition is getting there. And can be got there through kind of a very decentralized bottom up rank and file movement. If ever there is another revolutionary opening that comes along, that's the question I'm posing. I think that's the question.
Professor Göllner,
well,
what about the possible endurance of the councils?
Yes, I think this may or may not be the right time to bring in Nikos Poulantzas and his series and his ideas. I don't want to get bogged down too much in theoretical components, but suffice it to say that under capitalism, parliamentary democracy will always put working men and women at a disadvantage because the levers of power are in the hands of the 1%, the owners and controllers and managers of the means and distribution of economic goods and services. So we have to follow a different way. I don't think workers' councils have gone the way of the dodo. If we mean that workers' councils refers to autonomously organized units of self-management by the people who are producing goods and services for their community. Why shouldn't they control those processes? Why should only 1% of that community who lives off their profits control it? I think workers' councils or workers' self-management is still a possible route for the future. And I think that capitalism's inherent tendency to produce crises of major proportions. I mean, look at the consequences of the first depression in 1870, look at the Paris Commune, look at the consequences of the subsequent huge depressions and the scars that it has left on the face of humanity. And look what capitalism is doing to all of us right now, stuck in our homes because it was unprepared for a little germ. Workers and working women will be better prepared. They'll take care of themselves much better than the guy in the White House who thinks it's just something brought in here by a Chinaman and will be gone anytime, as he would say like that, Okay, sorry.
Thank you very much. If you allow me, I just like to add a small detail. I think that councils can be at the basis of a new form of government, but today we are living in a globalized world, globalized economy, so that the relations of production and misery are spread literally all over the earth. And for this reason, this kind of council republic will have to be a kind of global council republic. People will have to unite all over the world in a new sense, in a more profound way that they did at the beginning of the 20th century. So thank you very much, Professor Göllner. Thank you very much, Professor Mendel. I will now leave the stage to Jason. I think that he wanted to add something at the end. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Marie-José. Thank you, András. Thank you, David. That was a very engaging conversation. It was extremely exciting for me personally, as I've been learning a lot about these different topics from András and from Kari Polani. And it was great to hear your very advanced masterclass discussion. If you're interested in learning more about any of the topics that were touched on here, you can actually rewind to the beginning of this video after I'm done and hear more about the books that Black Rose has to offer on these subjects. I mentioned books by David Mandel. I talk about András's upcoming book, which Mary José contributes to, on the Forgotten Revolution in the 1919 Republic of Councils, and many other books that are about Russia and the Bolsheviks and participatory democracy. So you can go back to the beginning of the video to hear me talk about those and learn more about the most relevant books. I want to take another moment to thank our partners once again. We have many: Haymarket Books, Hungarian Free Press, the Karl Polanyi Research Center for Global Studies at Corvinus University, the Karl Polanyi Institute at Concordia, Esmalet Journal, the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, the International Strikes and Conflicts Association, and the Hungarian Studies Association of Canada. This video will remain at this link, so please share it with your friends and colleagues. It will be here forever, so you can go ahead and send this to them so they can tune in and watch and learn. To stay in touch, follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking the subscribe button below. You can look in the description for a link to subscribe to our newsletter so you can stay in touch with everything we're doing at Black Rose. We're very busy putting on events, publishing new books, and trying our best to do important work at this very transformative moment. To learn more about what we do, you can visit our website at www.blackrosebooks.com, or you can go to our ebook shop if you're an ebook reader. Our ebook shop is payhip.com/blackrosebooks. It should be on your screen now. On our ebook shop, you can donate, you can name your price on our books. Many of them just have a minimum price dollar of sometimes just $1 to get an ebook. We're giving away essentially our books on anarchism. They're incredibly inexpensive. We have a 3-volume collection on the history of anarchist thought, all 3 volumes for $3 right now. We're advertising it as the Ugly Anarchist collection in light of President Donald Trump's comments on anarchists. So we're really trying to demystify a lot of these topics, and we hope that you can visit that site and learn more about these things. With that, the wind is very strong where I am, hence that big bang. We're going to go ahead and conclude. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you to our participants one last time, and thank you to our partners. It was a real pleasure. I hope you'll stay in touch. And if you have any questions, you can email me at jason@blackrosebooks.com. So thank you. And with that, my colleague will go ahead and end this YouTube live stream, and we will conclude.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.